Hi, I'm William Stewart. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of 2 Timothy. I'm glad you're here. Wow, every video is just compact with such great advice, perspective, faith-building encouragement from the Apostle Paul, written to Timothy, probably in the early 60s AD, as Paul was ending the finality of his career. And Timothy was leading the church at Ephesus, facing some challenges, it seems, from both external and particularly perhaps internally to the church, which may have led to some discouragement. So this is one of the pastoral epistles focusing on how to minister to God's people. And it's really great for that. But it's in the backdrop of Timothy, and much of what Paul is writing, I perceive, is to encourage him and fortify him for his work ahead. So today we're in some fascinating verses between verses 11 and 13 in chapter 2. It's a very distinct style for Paul, and in terms of using parallel phrases in each of the three verses that seem to have its own, I hate to use the word cadence, but beat style that differs from his usual writing, and it stands out between the passages before and after. Now, he has done this before in 1 Timothy 3:16, also a pastoral epistle, in describing the first advent of Christ within a single verse. So these are both unique passages that seem to be doctrinally based. And it's important to realize that within the pastoral epistles, while they are highlighting ministry techniques, Paul also nicely drops in some very profound doctrine in and out of the passages, and several times they have this different style, perhaps to make them stand out. So in verse 11 it starts a faithful saying. So in Greek it's very nice, pistis logos, faithful, the word, and that it is used probably, this phraseology by Paul, probably 10 to 15 times. It's over a variety of topics, and so you can't really narrow it down to what type of information it's going to provide. I think he uses it as an attention getter to make the reader pause and know what is coming afterwards is important. For then it says, if we died with him, we so shall also live with him. So this refers back to spiritual baptism, best described in Romans 6, where as Christians, when we receive Christ by faith alone, on the death and resurrection of our Jesus Christ, our old self has died with him, identified with his death, and we are identified with his life, as it says here, we will also live with him. Now, interestingly, the future tense is used in the second phrase, and this is not unusual, but not common. Generally, when you see the future tense in the Greek, the original language of the New Testament, it is either tipping you off to an Old Testament quote, or is usually referring to another, what some would call dispensation or management scheme, past the church or past the Gospels into the church. In this case, I think it's talking about in time. So if we've died with him, thus we are a new person, we will live with him, and I think it's talking about eternity. Verse 12, if we suffer, we shall also reign with him. So it's again a promise that in eternity, in the future, we will reign with Christ. As he reigns, his people also will reign with him. This is talked about also in Revelation 2 and 3 about our authority over the nations and people during that time. We're not given details to how this works. It then says if we deny him, he will also deny us. Now, the word here is artemetha, and arneomai in the original Greek. It's typically used in context when we deny Christianity, when we deny the death and resurrection of Christ and do not become a Christian. So in doing so, much like Christ said to those who did not believe on him as Messiah, when he came the first time, he will deny us. So those people will not be in heaven. Verse 13 then becomes a little controversial. If we believe not, literally faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. So I've always interpreted this verse as that as a Christian, as opposed to verse 12, if we lose our faith, if we're not being faithful, he remains faithful to us, not being able to deny himself. Otherwise, he, through his death and resurrection, when a person becomes a Christian, he becomes legally adopted, becomes sealed, which has legal overtones. He's legally innocent. The word in the Greek has forensic meaning. The person, as we talked about, becomes a new person, identified with Christ. He is God's. So he doesn't push that person away, because a Christian is remade into the image of Christ, as we know from Colossians 3:10. So he can't deny himself. So our salvation remains secure despite our own lapses of faith. Now, as a true Christian, we will come back and ultimately believe, because we are a new person that's God's, and we have a mind, we have the spirit in the mind of Christ. However, as it turns out, on reviewing a number of commentaries, probably about half indicate that 13, those who believe not, who are faithless, are unbelievers. And he's saying God abideth faithful to his own righteousness, and will condemn those people because he cannot deny himself, his own righteousness, and his own wrath that a non-believer deserves. So which is right? You have the two interpretations, and choose for yourself. I probably lean towards the first one, that he's talking about believers and he's not going to deny a believer. I think in context, he's trying to encourage Timothy in his faith. And so to leave it on that downside is probably not, is going to be a little dark for Timothy in this context, which Paul has not been doing in 1st and 2nd Timothy. He's been trying to encourage him. But study the scripture yourself, study the verse yourself and the words, the Greek words and what they mean, and determine it for yourself out of faith. Okay, very interesting 3 passages, 3 verses, talking about our salvation in the middle of these pastoral epistles and God's faithfulness to us. Thanks be to God. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.